Okay, we should be live now.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's OUSSG event. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Carter Malkasian. Dr. Malkasian was the Special Assistant for Strategy to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, from 2015 to 2019. And he has extensive experience working in conflict zones, especially Afghanistan and Iraq, and has published several books. The highlight of his work in conflict zones was 2 years in Gamza district, Helmand province, Afghanistan, as a State Department political officer. His newest book, which came out this year, is The American War in Afghanistan, A History. And his 2013 book, War Comes to Gamza, 30 Years of Conflict on the Afghan Frontier, which was published by Oxford University Press, won the 2014 Silver Medal for the Council on Foreign Relations' Arthur Ross Book Award. Other books include Illusions of Victory, The Anbar Awakening and the Islamic State, A History of Modern Wars of Attrition, published in 2002, and The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Dr. Malkasian received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and completed his doctorate in history at Oxford University. As a person who lived for 2 years in Afghanistan, able to interact with the local population in their own language, Pashto, Dr. Malkasian is aware and sensitive to the culture of the Afghan communities, their needs, their grievances, and the constraints that they face. He kindly agreed to share with us his insights on why the war in Afghanistan failed to achieve its stated goals, based on his on-the-ground experience. So we're very eager to hear your perspective on this, Dr. Malkasian.
Anna, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for you all for being here today. It's really great to see everyone and to have the chance to speak with you all tonight. Now, I especially appreciate the chance to speak at Oxford because it's where I got my doctorate in the history of war, and it's where once upon a time I was also once the president of the Oxford University Strategic Studies Group. Which was a great honor and certainly gave me the chance to meet many people, both people within the university and, of course, the speakers who would come. So it's just wonderful to be here at OUSSG again. And when I was at Oxford, I'd say I got to Oxford in 1997, and then I left at the end of 2000. And my professor, when I was there for my doctoral advisor, who was my doctoral supervisor, was Professor Robert O'Neill. And he was, right now, the titular professor of war at Oxford, I believe, is Peter Wilson. Before that was Hugh Strawn. And then before that was Robert O'Neill. And so I never would have gotten involved in Afghanistan or Iraq before that, or written the kind of things I had if I hadn't been under Professor O'Neill. When I came to Oxford out of Berkeley and full of myself thinking I could write and know about all kinds of theoretical things, he guided me towards an understanding of what these kind of wars are like in places like Iraq or Afghanistan. Because while I wanted to study things about nuclear deterrence and things about great power war at the time, he focused me more on understanding, say, the Korean War and its attritional aspects that it had. And I can't think of a case that's been more useful in my career than knowing about the Korean War. And the other thing he did was he made me look at Vietnam, because Professor O'Neill had been an Australian intelligence officer in Vietnam with the Australian battalion that was there, seeing the villages and seeing combat up close. But he made sure that I understood what it meant to be dealing with an insurgency and what counterinsurgency was. And he made sure that all of his students, myself included, understood the flaws of what the United States had done in Vietnam. And that knowledge that he imparted made me all the better able to grapple with, tackle with, and, well, even fail at dealing with insurgencies and dealing with civil conflict during my own career. So I thought it'd be useful to share that since I'm talking at Oxford, and that's just how, just what kind of effect Oxford has had on my career, and of the career of many people who you may know or may not know. If you've heard of John Noggle, who wrote Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, he was also one of Professor O'Neill's students. If you've heard of Kurt Campbell, who is currently the special assistant for Asia within the National Security Council, and who had been assistant secretary for East Asia in the State Department during the Obama administration. He had been to Oxford and also studied there, and also studied under Professor O'Neill. So there's a whole long list of folks that have been influenced by the way Oxford approaches history, political science, and understanding the world around it. So with that said, I guess I'll shift to what you probably want to hear more about, which is Afghanistan. And yes, I want to talk today about why we lost. I want to discuss that question. As I do so, I also want to make clear that I'm going to talk about the longer history here. There was a dramatic defeat that happened in Afghanistan in August that myself and many others got wrapped into one way or another, even if we weren't there on the ground ourselves. Some of the causes I'll talk about failure that failed over the long war pertain to what happened when things fell apart quickly. But some of the specific reasons why things fell apart quickly are a little bit different and a little bit more tactical. And I'm not going to talk about those so much here, but I'm happy to talk about them in the question and answer period. Now, during my time in Afghanistan, and I first went to Afghanistan in 2007, I was very interested in the question of why isn't the United States succeeding? Why have we had such problems in Afghanistan? Why can't we succeed? If you remember, in 2001, we had a dramatic success in Afghanistan. The United States, its allies, including Britain, France, Canada, Australia, they managed to topple the Taliban regime. But after that, the Taliban managed to come back and threaten the government, so that by 2006, the government was actually in a very bad position. So I was very interested in this question in 2009, when I was a member of the State Department, and I was going to the district of Garmsir to go work. Now, Garmsir is in southern Afghanistan. It's in the province of Helmand. When I went there, I was working with the U.S. Marine Battalion. I've never been in the military myself. I've always been a civilian. Also, of course, working with the British, who were heavily in Helmand, the British Provincial Reconstruction Team, which I always have been extremely impressed with. So when I was going to Garmsir, I was thinking a lot about why have things gotten bad? Why does it seem like the government is having such a hard time succeeding? And why is the United States not making better progress? The first thing what I was thinking about was this should have something to do with grievances. This should have something to do with how the government has been mistreating people, and the allies of the government have been mistreating people. And the book that I was thinking most about in that regard was Sarah Che's book, The Punishment of Virtue, which remains one of the classics about Afghanistan. And in that book, she explains how the government and warlords would tax people, would steal their land, would falsely imprison people, and that created resentment, and how that resentment helped spawn the Taliban movement. So I went into Garmsir thinking the same thing. And indeed, I found examples of that. You can meet police chiefs who had abused people, hear the stories of what had happened in the past. Garmsir is also a place where there were deep, long-standing land issues. So there's not much water in Afghanistan, especially this part of Afghanistan. So who was closer to the water mattered, and who had good land mattered. But you'd find these disputes occurring where the government had tried to preserve its land or take the land of other people, and allowed people to have leases that created resentment. And those people who had resentment, many of them did help the Taliban or did give them some kind of support. So you could see that this answer was here. But then, as I studied things more, I found that there were more conditions, more reasons for why things were happening the way they were in Afghanistan. And the thing about understanding why we lost in Afghanistan is there isn't really one reason. There are multiple reasons. It's like peeling back an onion. And so what I began to discover as I did more and more of this is you can find a series of what we call in history of necessary conditions. A series of conditions that allowed the Taliban to succeed and prevented the government in the United States from having success. So we can say that grievances were one of these conditions. Another condition that comes up often is Pakistan. Pakistan had always had relations with the Taliban. Pakistan felt close to the Taliban because of India and their concerns about India, and they wanted to have a strong ally in Afghanistan so as not to be surrounded by enemies. So when we think about the case of Garmsir, what I learned there was that what happened wasn't solely about grievances. It was also about large numbers of Taliban coming from across the border to fight the government. So the fact that they could be in Pakistan, the fact that they could have refuge there, made a big difference. But that wasn't the only factor that existed here, because just because Taliban could come over the border doesn't mean that they were set to succeed. War is a competition between two opposing forces. And it's not just simply one side overruns the other. So how the defense was run, that matters a lot as well. And one of the most important things I discovered in Garmsir was how the defense was run very poorly. So for one thing, there wasn't an Iraqi army there when the Taliban were coming into the area. There was a very small police force. And the tribes themselves were divided between each other. They were divided between each other, and they were often fighting with each other or refusing to work together. So when the Taliban arrived, they faced an enemy that was divided, that didn't have large numbers of forces, and it was very easy for them to succeed. The divisions that happened in Garmsir and that happened elsewhere are very tied to the kind of system that the government had and that the tribes had. The government depended on tribes and other warlords to maintain its power. It depended on them to provide security in the provinces and in the districts. Now, in Afghanistan, tribes tend to compete with each other. And this happens many other places, but it can be particularly virulent in Afghanistan. This happens in Afghanistan because there is no singular leader of all the tribes or even a single tribe. It's comprised of different clans and groups that are set to compete with each other. It's almost like the international system, where there's anarchy in the international system, causing groups to compete and fight with each other. So that meant that there wasn't a strong defense. Now, this degree of infighting and this competition that doesn't pertain merely to the tribes. It also pertains to the security forces as they were built up. So in any district, as time went on, you could have a police force, army, NDS, but none of them had a singular commander. None of them had a single person in charge. And without that single person in charge, they too could tend to compete with one another, especially when they happen to care a lot about how much money they're bringing in or who's going to have enough power. And that kind of competition translated into the government itself, because the government itself, the people, the individuals involved in it, they were part of a certain tribe or a certain community or a certain political affiliation or a certain ethnic group. And that caused competition to happen within the government itself. The Taliban, in comparison, don't have that level of competition. Now, that's not to say that the Taliban are like some single, totally united group. They're not. They're not like the British Army, the Italian Army, or the United States Army. They have divisions too. However, they follow certain traditions and codes that enable them to have stronger unity. The Taliban are primarily led by by religious leaders. And a great book to read about this is Mullah Zaif's My Life with the Taliban, Abdul Salam Zaif. I'm sure it's in the library. But he describes very well how the Taliban have a different vision of themselves, and that vision is based more on unity. They pay more attention to obedience to who their leaders are. Part of this comes from the traditions that religious leaders have. So if a religious leader exists, the religious leader, like a mullah in a village, or the head of a madrasa, or a religious scholar who understands the Quran and the Hadiths very well, they will have students. It's understood that those students are going to obey what the religious leader wants. And as they develop those students, and as they get older, their students will have students. And that, in a way, creates kind of a set of obedience beneath some of these religious leaders. So the idea that they must compete with each other is much less. Another great book on this is David Edwards' book, Heroes of the Age. Really outstanding in understanding how the religious structures work inside of Afghanistan. So that gave them greater cohesion. And if you talk to the Taliban, you'll hear the same thing. Taliban leaders who I've spoken to, whether in Afghanistan or in Doha, have stressed very quickly, no, we are not like the government, we are united. Similarly, you can hear the same things said by government leaders. They will bring up this point. Often some of the most fearsome opponents of the Taliban will readily say, No, the Taliban are actually quite organized. They do things differently. They don't have the kind of fights that we have between each other. Abdul Razak, the dreaded commander of Kandahar, is one of those who told me, who said those very things. So you get grievances, Pakistan, and the kind of divisions that the government had within it. Those are some of the lessons that I took when I left Garmsir. Now, after Garmsir, I was working as the senior advisor to General Dunford when he was the commander of U.S. and all allied forces in Afghanistan. Also got to know General Carter at that time, who was extremely active. And during that time, I was able to get a better picture of what was happening in all of Afghanistan, not just the small little district, but the whole country. I got to go places, see different districts, see the north, see the east, see the south, see parts of the west. Even I spent the least time there, but got to see parts of it. And that made me to take what I learned in Garmsir, what I'd analyzed and researched in Garmsir, and look at it from a variety of places in the country. And what I discovered was in some places, those explanations worked as well. Those explanations work pretty well in Arghandab. They work pretty well in Panjwai. They work pretty well in certain places in the east. On the other hand, there are places they didn't work as well. There's places where the situation was different and grievances might have played a much, much bigger role. There were places on the border with Pakistan where Pakistan played a much larger role. And there were certain places that just seemed to have their own dynamics going on. But also during that time there, I started to realize that something else was going on in Afghanistan, something that was bigger than what I had seen before. Because in my time there, I was seeing that again and again, the Afghan forces were still having difficulty succeeding. And I could take the explanations I found before and try to apply it to that, but I was forcing the explanations, I was forcing the evidence into my explanations, which all of you who are studying methodology and such, you know you're not supposed to do that. That's the great danger of using history to test political science theories, is you're always tempted to take the evidence that you're seeing on the ground and stick it into the theory. So I became worried as I found myself doing that. And I started to look at some other additional explanations for what was going on. And one of them that comes up very regularly is corruption. It's not, I mean, certainly in the news, you've now heard about the degree of corruption that existed in Afghanistan. You've probably heard about the Kabul Bank scandal, where the brothers of Hamid Karzai were stealing money out of the country through the Kabul Bank, taking away investors' own money and putting it into their pockets. You've probably heard about the Afghan army and the Afghan police that often would have more soldiers in their rank, more soldiers on their rolls on paper than actually were there on the ground, so that they could collect the salaries of those non-existent ghost soldiers. You've probably heard also how they sold their weapons or hoarded the weapons so they wouldn't be used. And you've probably heard how they would often establish posts that would tax people as they would go by. So all of those issues one could discover the more time one spent in Afghanistan. That explanation is pervasive and no doubt a problem for Afghanistan. But it also has trouble explaining everything, because the sad truth is that the Afghan forces in battle, whether in Sangin, whether in Andar, in Ghazni, whether in Paktika, or in Kunar, they often were defeated even when they outnumbered the enemy, even when they had more weapons than the Taliban, even when they had more ammunition than the Taliban. So the corruption certainly plays a role there and is reducing effectiveness, but it's not quite enough to explain the defeats that are happening, because an expectation is, as long as one's morale is sufficient, then when you have superiority in arms, then the battle should go one's way. But that was not, of course, what we were seeing. Now that brings us to the morale question, which is the most important reason as to why I don't want to say the most important, but I'd say a very weighty reason as to why we have had problems in Afghanistan. That too often the morale of the Iraqi police and army would be less than that of the Taliban. Too often we'd hear that a post had fled before the Taliban when they'd taken minor amounts of fire from the Taliban. Too often we had superior numbers, had given up all their ammunition, all their tanks, all their vehicles to the Taliban and ran away. That doesn't say that was always the case. There's many, many times when the Afghans were fighting hard. So I'm not trying to say that that people didn't die and suffer for their democracy. They did. But that doesn't change the fact that the Taliban too often were succeeding. So this morale problem one reason for this is that it's connected to the corruption. That is, the fighters and the soldiers on the ground, as the policemen and soldiers on the ground, saw that their commanders weren't fighting for them. They were more inclined to run and not want to fight. I saw this myself when I went to the battlefield in Sangin in 2014. And you'd see some Afghans who had, especially the tribal forces, who had fairly good leadership or cared a lot about their homes, would be more willing to fight. Where you'd see the army, whose commanders didn't want to leave their bases, were worried about IEDs, and were not apt to go and readily supply or help those in combat, you could see that their soldiers were less willing to get in combat. Sami Sadat, who was the last commander in Helmand, he actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this, about how this was a factor. So it's an important consideration that needs to be taken into hand. But this one, too, I would say, is not the only explanation that we need to be looking at. Because even with that problem, we can identify Afghan units like the Special Operations Forces who actually don't have a lot of corruption problems, who have very good leadership. And yet still, if they don't have U.S. support, U.S. air power, they had trouble in combat. We can see the same thing with various tribal forces who had better had better leadership and generally cared more about some of the things that they were fighting for. They would still have these kind of problems. And we can twist this also a little bit to look at the Taliban, because this implies that a force with better leadership and was taking better care of its people would have higher morale. But the Taliban leaders often stayed in Pakistan. The Taliban leaders weren't known for taking great care of their men. They often didn't get pay at all. They often had very low amounts of ammunition and didn't have good arms and were not as well supplied or armed as the government forces were. So that still begs, why do we have this morale problem? And the reason that I've turned to, and I think is an important one, but again, I'd say it's one of many necessary conditions, is that the Taliban had an edge in inspiration. The Taliban had an edge in inspiration that came from the fact that they were fighting occupation. That would be the occupation of us in Afghanistan. And that they were able to portray themselves as closer to Islam. So Afghanistan has a long history of fighting occupation. And that actually comes long before the British arrived in Afghanistan. It comes from their wars with the Mughals, their wars with the Safavids in the 1500s and the 1600s. You can read the poetry of Khoshala Khan, one of their warrior poets in the 1600s, talking about fighting the Mughals and how there was glory. And you can read about the similar poems from the most famous poet, Abdurrahman Baba, where value is put in being willing to stand and fight for your country. Now, that's no different from what occurs in many countries. So I'm not trying to say there's something tremendously unique about Afghanistan, but merely to point that this is a part of the identity that exists there. And you can also see this, you can see this more directly during the time that we were there. You could look at it in the multiple polls that came out. They would regularly show that a significant percentage of Afghans felt that the Taliban were fighting to resist occupation or for Islam or for jihad. You could also see it in some of the polling that was done of Afghans, it's more like large number of interviews. So like often people like Ashley Jackson would talk to say 50 to 100 Taliban. And then they'd be able to compute those results. Often in those kind of studies, and there's a decent amount of them, there's about 7 or 8 of them. Usually the same thing was found, the same kind of results where the Taliban where the researchers says the Taliban are clearly fighting for jihad and have this that's motivating them to a strong extent. The government had more difficulty with motivation in that way. The government, soldiers and police were more inclined to question why they were fighting, to question legitimacy of the government, to question why they were fighting on the side of occupiers. One of the best surveys that I like to refer on this one was a survey done earlier in the teens, and it went through 7 different police forces, and it surveyed the policemen as to why they were fighting. And the survey results were that only 10% of the police said they had joined the police in order to fight the Taliban. Now, certainly I can assure you a larger percentage of Taliban had decided to join the Taliban in order to fight. And of that 10%, they also, only 10% said that, and they found also throughout the police force itself that there were strong concerns about the legitimacy of fighting fighting alongside an occupier, and also a great deal of concern about the legitimacy of a government that wasn't fighting purely for jihad or for Islam. So these kind of concerns were clearly present in the thinking that existed. And you could also see it not just from what the Taliban would say. The Taliban would often say they were fighting for jihad, and this is the reason that they were conducting what they were doing. And you could readily hear it every time you talk to the Taliban. But also government figures would say the same thing. Government figures would say similarly, and a good example of that one is Bismillah Khan, who was a Panjshiri commander, who was the Minister of Defense, who was thought to be one of the staunchest opponents of the Taliban, who readily said that the Taliban fight for ideology. Our forces do not fight for ideology. Our forces are not as strongly motivated as the Taliban are. So these are just all an assortment of empirical evidence as to why this is a factor that pertains. And the last thing I want to say on this particular point is that, the argument here is not that like Islam created violence or something like that, or that Islam promotes terrorism. The argument is that it's much harder for a policeman or a soldier to fight alongside an occupier, especially if that occupier has a different religion. And when the opposite side can therefore portray themselves as being closer to the religion of the country. So what all these factors, all these conditions I mentioned have in common is they're all really hard to overcome. They're all really hard to resolve. They're not things that can be easily solved by a bright decision maker or 100,000 troops. They are things that are inherent and intrinsic to a country. And when faced with that kind of problem, means that the odds of succeeding in Afghanistan were always fairly low. In the question and answer period, we can talk a little bit about what opportunities may have existed and what chances there were, but they're all fairly narrow. And that, of course, begs the question, why didn't the United States leave a great deal earlier? Why didn't the United States and its allies get out earlier and realize that this was a problem? So I'd like to spend the last few minutes of the talk going over that. So it's terrorism, the attacks of 2001 underlined a threat that hadn't been clear before. In the 1990s, terrorism just wasn't thought to have been a threat to the United States or its allies the way it was after those events happened in 2001. To give you an example, in the summer of 2001, having just received my doctorate, I was going to a conference where there were a number of bright luminaries and some of the most. And it was a 4-day conference. We were spending the night in the place we were having the conference. Some of the greatest luminaries of political science and policy making were there. And I remember distinctly someone else who just received their PhD and had done it on counterinsurgency. And they gave a presentation saying how this form of warfare is going to be something we need to be worried about, how it's going to continue to be relevant over the next 20 years. And everyone in the audience said, no, this isn't something you need to worry about. You're wrong. The world's going in a different direction. It's all about high-tech warfare. It's all about wars like the wars in Kosovo or the war in 1991 against Iraq. But 2001 showed that no, there was something to be concerned about, and those attacks showed that it was possible that the terrorists might not just blow up buildings; they might try to use biological, chemical, nuclear weapons. Now, a lot of those fears were overblown, but it doesn't mean the fears weren't real. Polling at the time in 2001 and 2002 shows that 50 to 85% of Americans were worried about another attack. So President Bush was not in an easy place to get out of Afghanistan. He had to worry that if he didn't prove himself willing to deal with that terrorist threat, he had to worry if another attack occurred, that he would face a great backlash amongst the American people. So there's a very large political cost to getting out. That political cost sustains itself on at least through 2011. President Obama faces the same problem when he becomes president in 2009. And you have to think, in 2009, that's not that long after the Madrid bombing, the London subway bombings, and the Heathrow plot. So all of those things were still in line, and Osama bin Laden was still at large. So President Obama had to have the same concern about a political backlash if he doesn't do something about the terrorist problem. And when it came to Afghanistan, there was a great debate about what should happen in Afghanistan when he was president, a debate over the surge. But what that debate was not over was whether to get out. President Obama said it several times during the course of that debate, and that debate is now actually pretty well documented through a variety of sources. He said it several times. This debate is not about leaving Afghanistan. We are going to stay in Afghanistan. That only changed after the death of Osama bin Laden and after the surge proved itself to be so expensive. When President Obama started to turn to look to other means to keep down the terrorist threat without having to stay in Afghanistan. He even planned to get out. In May of 2014, he announced all U.S. forces would leave at the end of 2016. But that plan didn't hold. It didn't hold because the Islamic State rose up and took over half of Iraq, and also appeared in Afghanistan. And at the same time, the Taliban were regaining ground in Afghanistan. So in 2015 and 2016, President Obama had to change what he was doing, had to shift and decide to keep forces in Afghanistan, which is the decision that he made in July of 2016, leaving 8,400 troops in Afghanistan. President Trump, as much as he wanted to get out, and he was extremely determined to get out, at the same time repeatedly was worried about terrorist attacks. Several times he'd state, I need to maintain forces there to keep a CT presence. When the Taliban when the Taliban killed American soldiers and looked like they'd be a bad negotiating partner, he walked out of negotiations until his demands were met. And in the end, even though there was an announcement that in November of a year ago that the United States would pull out all forces from Afghanistan, he left 2,500 troops there. So it proved hard for Trump to get out as well. Now, President Biden was obviously able to get out. But the point I'd make there is that the strategic environment has now dramatically changed. The strategic environment of 2001 no longer exists. The Islamic State was defeated or heavily suppressed in 2017 by 2017 and 2018. That terrorist threat isn't there anymore. Moreover, the world at large has bigger concerns. The world at large is concerned about climate change. The world at large is concerned about COVID. More people died in the United States at the height of COVID. More people died every day than died on 9/11. So these are reasons as to how the strategic context changed and the impetus to stay in Afghanistan had decreased. So it's only after that point, it's only in that context that Biden is able to leave. Now, that's not to say that there might have been some chance earlier for Obama, Trump, or Biden to get out. It's simply to recognize the structure of the international system and the context that existed at the time and how that made it more difficult to get out. And that paints Afghanistan and what happened there more like a tragedy, less like something that the United States, Britain, France, Germany, all of the allies had a chance to make a different choice on than one in which they were compelled to go through, a trial that all those countries had to endure on, and that they were unlikely to succeed in, but that there wasn't really a choice in the matter. So I'll end on that, and hopefully we can get into some questions, and perhaps some of you will tell me what I've got wrong or what I can improve on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malkasian, for this really detailed overview of the interlinking of all the explanations. So we're going to open up the floor to questions. If you're on the call and would like to ask a question, please either use the raise hand function or type it in the chat. And if you're on YouTube following us and would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and I'd be happy to read it out. If I may start with the first question, actually, you mentioned about that a lot of these causes of the failure were very hard to resolve. So, for example, the lack of unity within the government compared to the Taliban, or the benefit of the Taliban in terms of the ideology. And I was wondering, does that mean that any such war is hard to fight? And what would be your conclusion in terms of either things that could have been done better, or whether perhaps entering such a war is probably just not the best idea in hindsight?
So, this is, Afghanistan is one case, and it's not, I've studied Afghanistan heavily, I've studied Iraq heavily, I have some familiarity with Vietnam and some other places. I haven't checked on the general, I haven't done enough work to say that what I've said here is valid across all conflicts. But I guess, to be honest, I don't expect it to be. As a historian, I expect that the explanations for one conflict will be different from the explanations from another. But that said, I think what we've seen since 2001 in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'd point to Syria the same way, is that the reasons for conflict there are very hard for outsiders to solve. And the forces, and for us to stay in those conflicts is extremely expensive, especially for us to attempt to solve them and stay in those conflicts is very expensive. We can turn the conflict over to the host country that we've been working with, and we can give it to them. But often they too have great trouble in succeeding. It seems as if once we leave, and this is what happened in Iraq and what happened in Afghanistan, things go the wrong way, that those government forces aren't able to stand up on their own. And I think some of the reasons I've just listed for you are the reasons why that's the case. So what that means is that we're kind of confronted with two choices. The international community can decide that we would like to stay in these countries to suppress whatever the threat is for as long as we're there, with the understanding that if we leave, that threat and those problems or that instability is going to resume. Now, knowing that we'd have to stay there for a long time, we should be very inclined to stay with as few forces as possible with a very small presence. So therefore, it's affordable. Now, this argument is basically the same argument that Rory Stewart made to the U.S. Congress in 2009. It's also an argument a close friend of mine, Cale Weston, who's also a book author, makes a lot. And it's very similar to what General Dunford would say when he told President Obama and President Trump that being in Afghanistan is like term life insurance. You get the life insurance as long as you're paying. Once you stop paying, that life insurance is gone. Now, people often don't like that analogy because it's because I don't know people I don't know. Anyways, people don't always seem to like that analogy, but I think it's apt. Now that's choice number one: stay long, stay with a few forces. The other choice is not to get in at all. Or if you're in, to realize that it's not going to go the way you want and to leave, like President Biden did. Because if you see that you're going to have to stay there a long time and it's going to be costly and things aren't going to improve, one may decide it's just not worth it. The threat of terrorism or the threat of instability or even the human rights problems that may exist, that it's just not worth it for one's country or for the larger international community if they decide that together. So those are the two choices that exist. When it comes to things that your second question, when it comes to things that could have gone different in Afghanistan, how could we have done things better? So one that comes up very, very common is that we should have brought the Taliban into the Bonn process. The Bonn process was happening from 2001 to 2005, and it's the process by which a new constitution was created for the new Afghanistan. It's the process by which they decided to have a president, and then the elections for the president. So it went for several years, but in that process, the Taliban were excluded. There's some evidence that the Taliban were interested in being involved in that. There's also a decent amount of evidence that a variety of Taliban leaders just wanted to go live at home and be left alone. But the United States forbade them from being a part of the Bonn process. President Karzai was actually fairly interested in that. And we didn't allow any of them to live at home. If there was a Taliban who was a senior leader in Afghanistan, there were attempts made to detain them, often successfully, which drove many of them back into the arms of the movement itself. All right, so if we had done that, now maybe there would have been a chance for a long-standing peace, and I definitely think we should have done it. But just because there might have been a chance doesn't mean it would have come about. Because we don't know if Mullah Omar would have been okay with it. We don't know if other leaders like Jalaluddin Haqqani, the father of Sirajuddin Haqqani, or Mullah Dadullah Lang, who was one of their foremost and most Al-Qaeda affiliated commanders in the early 2000s, we don't know if they would have gone for it, or if they would have obeyed it if Mullah Omar said to do it. So we have some uncertainty there. But we should have done it, and when that gets to is probably the more important point. We could have managed the conflict better. Perhaps we couldn't have succeeded in the conflict, but we could have managed it better. We could have adopted strategies and undertaken options that would have allowed us to pay fewer costs and lose fewer lives. And there's a variety of other points we could mention beyond this Bonn process one, where similar possibilities existed. So what is, it's hard to find a lot of examples that say you could have won Afghanistan. But it's very easy to find many places where we could have chosen a different option or considered more options and made the whole thing more sustainable and saved lives.
Thank you so much. I think the first hand I saw up was Lydia's, so please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much. Doctor, I wonder if I could please ask you, is there an assumption that the benefits of democracy are obvious and inherent to the peoples of Afghanistan when in fact they perhaps weren't? And is there perhaps a lack of understanding of how inherently attractive franchise jihadi terrorism is? I asked, just reflecting on what you just said earlier in your talk about how inspired and inspiring those fighting for the Taliban were compared to those Afghans that were fighting with the West or allied with the government forces. Because I reflect on the fact that during the efforts to combat Islamic State from 2014 onwards, there was a campaign by the State Department called Welcome to ISIS Land, which I personally thought was very poorly judged because essentially it consisted of putting Arabic videos in YouTube of Islamic State propaganda saying, ISIS are bad, don't join them, don't go to Syria, look how awful they are. And it occurred to me that really it was just promoting their own publicity. They were making it because it was obviously inherently attractive to them to share all of these glossy, violent videos. So I wonder whether then, if in 2014 onwards, the US government and the French government indeed were trying to say, don't join Islamist terrorists, they're bad, look at their stuff that they do, look at their videos of them doing atrocities, aren't they evil? If there was no understanding then that terrorists produce their propaganda because there is a market for them and because it's glossy and because it works and it does recruit people for them. Am I perhaps right in thinking there was also a lack of understanding in Afghanistan of how inherently attractive franchise jihadi terrorism is, how people want to join the likes of the Taliban, and at the same time, a lack of understanding as to the merits and attractiveness of democracy, which we consider were inherent and obvious, but perhaps we need to better explain. Thank you.
Thank you, no problem. Good questions. So the democracy. So yeah, I would say that we, the United States, and I might extend that to our allies and partners as well, have a tendency to believe that the fruits of democracy are self-evident, and that everyone should want to be involved in it. And so we probably neglected how I think I'd say we particularly neglected was how saying democracy automatically had a connection to occupation. So I remember in 2013 and 2014, I had a few mullahs and other leaders say, stop talking about democracy. Just talk about elections. We understand when you talk about elections, but when you say democracy, it means something that the West does that you're trying to impose upon us, and you're trying to change our values. Just say elections. And I told that to a variety of senior leaders, and they didn't believe me. Because they had talked to other Afghans who had made it seem like they liked democracy, but then they went and talked to their Afghan partners, and they actually told them the same thing: talk about elections, not democracy. But when I say that, I also don't mean to imply that every Afghan didn't like democracy. I don't think that's true either. Afghanistan has a variety of different people, a variety of different views, and there are people who believe strongly in democracy and saw it as a way to make their country better and avoid the problems that it had. So I mean, there's definitely a mix. But I mean, I think you're right that we naturally assume things. It's very natural to do this. It's one of the dangers of being a foreigner in another country. You kind of assume things are self-evident when they're not. So that probably goes along to your question about the information operations. So as a rule, I consider there's a strong, whenever an outside country is doing information operations, there's a very strong chance one is doing harm. That one is actually doing things that are going to undermine any empathy or sympathy the inhabitants of that country has for your own country. Furthermore, we tend, because we don't understand the dynamics of the countries we go to, and I mean, I say the same, I don't think I understand Afghanistan. I can speak one of their two languages. I've spent lots of time there, but the more I'm there, the less I feel I know. The more I'm there, the more I can look back and think, well, just 3 years ago, I made a big mistake because I did this and this, and I shouldn't have done that. Longer there, the more you realize that you're making mistakes. So information operations assumes you know a whole lot about that community and about those people. So when you do it, you're taking this risk that you'll be creating harm. So I think that's my basic answer to that piece there. The other thing I would like to state, though, is that the Taliban and the Islamic State are different. So the Islamic State used much more hideous photography and videos, and did many more atrocities than the Taliban did. And the Taliban won support not for the atrocities that they did, but the fact that they can represent something, the fact that they're fighting occupation, but and tied to that is that the Taliban are the village mullahs, or often were the village mullahs. They're tied to the countryside. They're tied to the average villager. The average villager understands the Taliban. They pass messages through poetry, through text messages, through preaching at the mosque. Yes, there are night letters, and yes, they do videos of attacks and such, but it's generally not the same as the Islamic State. But I just want to make sure I differentiated that there.
Thank you very much. Of course, Islamic State go in a lot for poetry as well, but as you say, very different dynamic to the Taliban. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. for your very, very comprehensive answer.
Oh, thank you very much. So the next question will come from Andy Laurie. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you for joining us today, Dr. Malkasian. Really great to hear from you. My question is to ask whether you could perhaps take us through your thoughts on the legal basis for the war in Afghanistan, and indeed the war on terror, both in terms of whether historically and looking backwards, the incredibly broad nature of the 2001 AUMF has led to the wars, these endless wars, and the fact that they've continued, but also whether the fact that it was basically a war waged by the executive branch without the need for bipartisan measures to go through Congress has indeed contributed to the ongoing nature and perhaps the ultimate outcome, but then also moving forwards, is it actually then important to really fully closing the cycle of endless or forever wars? Is it important to repeal the AUMFs and start afresh? Many thanks.
No, thank you, Andy. So I'm going to go backwards. So yes, I think it's important to repeal the AUMF. I think that the Constitution is clear enough that the Congress approves going to war, and that should be that should be continued and not avoided through an AUMF. So I definitely agree with that. I also think that the AUMF, the authorization to use military force that was approved, and it was approved and it was meant to go after Al Qaeda, but it listed other groups that could be affiliated with it. So over time, the definition of what that could be expanded, and eventually expanded to be allowed to include the Islamic State. Now, theoretically, you might have been able to say the Islamic State came from AQI, Al Qaeda in Iraq, and Al Qaeda in Iraq came from Al Qaeda. So you might be able to draw that line, but there's no doubt that it allowed the use of military force in what was basically a war against a variety of other opponents beyond purely Al Qaeda, the Taliban, or Afghanistan. So I definitely see that as problematic. Now, the problem, the thing for Afghanistan is I'm not sure how much of a difference it would have made in Afghanistan. And the reason I say that is because I think if President Bush had asked for a declaration of war in 2001, I think he would have gotten it. The degree of bipartisan support for the action against Afghanistan was quite overwhelming. And so I think that he would have been able to secure that. And then once that war was declared, he would have had the legal ability, unless Congress put something else in it for further confirmation, which I'm not sure they would have done that. Then he could have carried on the war as long as the war was carried on. It's also important to remember that Afghanistan has had tremendously low salience in America. And I would dare to say in Europe as well, that there hasn't been concern. The war hasn't had a lot of popular support, but it hasn't had popular opposition as well. This isn't the kind of domestic politics of Vietnam. It's hard to think of anti-war protests that occurred over the 20 years of the conflict. No one has the fact that there hasn't been conscriptions and been volunteer militaries that suppressed the degree of opposition that existed to it. There's been very little action in Congress to oppose it. So that allowed things to move forward. Now, if I was to take a little bit of a counterfactual and to say that, well, actually, I'd take a big counterfactual, and I was to say that there was a declaration of war, but there was some requirement that it be reviewed in Congress, or that Congress had to make future decisions, then it is possible after 2011 that you could have seen more resistance to doing things, and perhaps an earlier departure. But there's a decent amount of counterfactual in that, so I want to be careful.
Thank you. So next up, we have a question from our YouTube chat from Andy Payne, who is a research fellow here at the DPIR and is also former OUSSD president. And he asks, on the question of why the US didn't or couldn't withdraw sooner, the absence of permissive structural conditions makes sense, but could you say more about the domestic political factors that constrained each president's freedom of action and why Biden was able to overcome them where his predecessors failed?
So I think for each of them, they face the main concern here is what happens if there is another attack. And I guess I'd have to stress this a lot. So there were some immediate political problems if one left, in terms of the Republicans in Congress. There are certain factions of the Republican Party were opposed to it. That included under Trump, who had to face resistance from some fairly powerful senators and such, including Mitch McConnell, if he wanted to get out. And so all of them would have to use political capital to get out of Afghanistan. and say how much President Obama wanted to use that political capital in 2009 I don't think he wanted to use that political capital. He had other things that he wanted to take care of. But that immediate use of political capital is the less important issue. The more important issue was what happens if there is an attack. So what the decisions repeatedly came to, and this happened in just, we went through this question of do you leave Afghanistan, and how low of troops do you take it to? This comes up repeatedly from 2011 onward. And it always comes down to the same question, which is a terrorist group going to reform, especially Al-Qaeda? Will they be able to attack the United States? When will they be able to attack the United States? And the assessments were regularly that, yes, one will form if we're not able to provide counterterrorism pressure. So that leaves the president with the question of, if I get out and there is an attack, what happens politically? And that was something that concerned Trump, on what kind of backlash was going to be faced if an attack occurs. And it's that uncertainty that played a large role there. Now, I think for Biden, what happens by the time that Biden comes in is a few things. First of all, the option of staying in became a lot uglier. So he knew that if he stayed in with 2,500 troops, the war was probably going to be more violent. We'll leave aside if he was going to have to throw in reinforcements or not, and just say it was going to be more violent. It was going to demand more time. It was going to be it was going to end up sucking up part of his time and part of his agenda. With 2,500 troops, the chances of a negotiated solution were basically nil. The Taliban could see room for some gains on the battlefield. They had gained on the battlefield. So the chances that they were now going to agree to the things that we wanted were very, very small, which meant he wasn't just looking at a few months of war to coerce the Taliban into something. He was looking at years and years and years of war to get something to happen. At the same time, like I mentioned before, the structural conditions had changed, and there were greater concerns in the United States. So the penalty from leaving, I think, appeared to be less. I guess what I don't know is if to look back in retrospect, I don't know if at the time they would have considered the cost that's now been paid to be too high or too low. I think I am confident saying that before Biden, the reason that people didn't leave, or a reason, was they didn't want to see what happened in August happen on their watch.
Thank you very, very much. So our next question will come from the call from Dick Green. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Malkasian. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
As you can see, I'm not a student. The two words that I don't think I heard in your presentation were United and Nations. And in fact, there's a third word that I didn't hear, and that's governance. You've talked about a US failure. I would suggest that it's a UN failure. And I wonder, therefore, should we, you and all of us, support the UN more? Should we support some other organization? And the other point that concerns me, you talked about the strategic environment had changed. Surely this could change again. If I mention two more words, Ukraine and Taiwan. One of the messages that came out of the very quick decision by Joe Biden was it sent a message that the US could not be relied on, and the implication of that could be serious as far as Ukraine and Taiwan are concerned. I'd be very interested to hear your views. Thank you.
So regarding the United Nations, the United Nations has been deeply involved in Afghanistan for years, starting with the bond process in 2001. They oversaw the bond process. And the United States was deeply involved as well. And they helped with the first elections that were done in Afghanistan. After that, they continued to be a main interlocutor. They didn't run the elections after that, but they were deeply involved with how the Afghan efforts to run the elections, and they were kind of in somewhat of an oversight role. And the UNAM, the United Nations mission to Afghanistan, that's still open today, if I'm remembering properly. So that stayed open a long time. Did a variety of good work, looking at a variety of governance issues, plus human rights issues. And it has been present in many provinces. There was a UN compound and UN officers. So the United Nations certainly has been deeply involved in it. I wouldn't call it so much of a failure on the United Nations part. Should the United Nations have advocated more heavily for Taliban participation in bond? Yes, I think so. I think that was probably a main mistake for them. The Taliban, afterwards, the United Nations did stay connected to the negotiations that were happening in Doha, but the Taliban didn't want to use them as a mediator because the Taliban saw them as tainted. The Taliban saw them as having helped create the bond process. So they didn't trust them. They didn't want to use them again. But I remain I remain to think that the United Nations has a role in these places. I think that the United Nations, could have perhaps been a good mediator. And I think it was wise to have the United Nations involved in 2001 and 2002. I think it's regrettable that both the United Nations and the United States weren't willing to have the Taliban be part of the process. Regarding Ukraine and Taiwan, so what I see is the United States is facing the problem that it's faced in the past and other countries have faced in the past. You can say that we've either suffered a defeat somewhere or we've withdrawn from somewhere that we don't consider to be of strategic interest, which means that adversaries and allies may question, is this just an example of the United States got out of an area that was of low interest to it and it was causing it costs? Or is this the case the United States isn't willing to fight places? Now, I think that over time, hopefully that gets cleaned up and it's clear what interests the United States cares about fighting for, what interests the United States does not care about fighting over. And so I'd point to Vietnam, where that eventually happened. It took a few years for that to occur. I might point to, if I dare, I might point to 1783, and that after a little bit of time, it became clear that what happened in the United States had nothing to do with the willingness of the British Empire to fight in other places. So I think time will clean that up. In the meantime, I think what the United States should be doing is demonstrating clearly to its allies that we are committed, that the interests that we've had since 1945 and before that remain interests. And as in the past, so that we've been willing to fight for them, we remain willing to fight for them. And I think for some of the interests that you named, I think they're deep enough there that that'll come out clear. But you are right that it has to be a concern. There has to be a concern that an adversary will misinterpret or even an ally will misinterpret.
Thank you very much.
So we've come up to the hour, but we still have 2 questions left. Would you have time to take those?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much. So the first one then from Ijoma here in the call.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Malkasian, for your treatise. Really interesting, the insights on the strategy. My questions focus more on what you think about how intelligence gathering is going to go forward following Kabul. From the American perspective, we've seen that the CIA is announcing that they're scrambling for a new approach in Afghanistan and looking for different bases besides Pakistan and the others. From Britain's perspective, we have some ex-Delta 011 intelligence officers that worked with Britain to help with our effort, but we were unable to evacuate them as much as we evacuated about 25 of those officers. So I'm just wondering how you think that's going to play out going forward, and if you see that as a failure post the fall of Kabul in terms of intelligence gathering, and if you think that there is a sort of strategy that we could, what you feel about what's happened so far, and if there's a strategy that can be employed going forward in that space.
So a lot of that space is a little bit hard to talk about. So what I would say, so it seems to me it's shifting more to kind of traditional techniques that are used in various countries, and that we were in Afghanistan before, and we had the ability to see a lot and do a lot because we were there. But that's not usually how intelligence organizations have to work. It's not usually how the State Department works. It's often much more limited. And I suspect that everyone's just going to have to get used to some of that. And I know there's ways to mitigate and other things that can be done, but overall, I think when you look at the big picture, that's what's occurring. I also worry that, we left Afghanistan because there was a decision that the interest wasn't worth it. That the threat of terrorism wasn't that great, and that getting out was more beneficial. So some of the things we're seeing right now are simply the costs of that decision. That we won't have the same kind of presence that we did before. It's natural that we won't. But the decision was that, well, we're willing to bear that. Now, that may prove wrong as we see indications of greater terrorist threat. And as you're kind of alluded to, well, maybe we won't see them. And that's also just a risk of it as well. But we can also think about it from different directions rather than what we have to do in Afghanistan. We can also think about in terms of what we need to do in our own countries, what kind of work can be done there to provide the protection of our own countries. And then we can also think about if protection is not entirely possible, we can think about resilience. That if an attack occurs, do we have to react? Do we have to change our national policies? Do we have to not remove the AUMF? Do we have to go back into Afghanistan, or can we just take it? The attacks are not likely to be much worse than the losses we've seen from COVID and other events over the past few years. So why terrorism has to be special is not entirely clear to me. So that resilience part I'd put a lot of stress on. But you asked a good question about intelligence and how to collect it and how to get around it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of it's just going to be more difficult.
Do you see the officers that we've left behind? Do you see them as a risk? Because some of the reports that have been gathered is that they are currently joining the Taliban, some of them, and assisting them in their effort. So do you see that as a negative thing for the West, or?
Well, is it negative? Yes, it's negative. Is it likely to happen? Yes, it's likely to happen. People need to survive, and some people are going to surrender. And I don't know if for the people who are working with us, working with the Taliban, I don't know if how negative that is. Many of them may not have, I don't know what kind of information they have or anything like that. But if someone is left alone in their country and their country is being controlled by the folks that they were opposing, then they don't have a lot of choice on what they can do. And some of them will act to save their lives, and that's natural. I think our care for that, maybe not with intelligence operatives, but our care about what happened to those that worked with us, that had a lot to do with the evacuation that was conducted, trying to get as many people out as possible. But in an event like what occurred, it's not going to be possible to get everyone out. So yes, those are risks and costs that are entailed.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So now from our final question from the YouTube chat is from Raja, who is a fellow here at the Changing Character of War Center. He asks, how do you see the conflict playing out going forward? How might the soldiers who are being disbanded react? And what, if any, will be the impact of the factional struggles within the new regime? So I think you may have touched on this already a little bit.
So right now, it looks like the Taliban are on top of the conflict. So the major groups that were other than the Islamic State, the major groups that are opposing the Taliban have been defeated or not fighting very hard, which means it's likely for the next year or so that those groups won't be doing major fighting. Now, the Islamic State will probably continue to do things, and it will probably at least continue to be an irritant to the Taliban. And we could make a variety of guesses as the direction that this is going to go, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Taliban remain an irritant for many years. It would surprise me if the Islamic State is able to seriously threaten the Taliban. The Taliban won the war. They have a tremendous advantage in legitimacy right now. And a lot of Afghans are tired of fighting, so I don't feel that the Islamic State is going to be a great threat to the Taliban regime. But an irritant, yes, that can continue over time. Looking for the longer term, looking out 4, 5, 6 years, that's when the major questions come into play. That's when the major questions come into play about will the Taliban manage to run the country effectively, or will they start to suffer more problems? Afghanistan, like I mentioned, has endemic water and land issues. It's hard to get everyone to agree to whose land is whose. And as the population expands, more people want land. So they're going to have trouble keeping everyone underneath them happy. Then, well, if there's problems with famine over the winter, problems with economic development, lack of wages, lack of money, that's also going to create some discontent for the Taliban. And we also have to think about the region. Will Russia, Iran, Pakistan, China, the Central Asian states, will they all stay in a position where they feel like they can support the Taliban government, which will help bolster them? Or will they start to have some issues between each other? Each of them with their own proxies in Afghanistan wanting to support different groups, and will that help fuel conflict over time? These are some of the bigger questions that are there, and the longer we go, the more likely it is that the Taliban will face some kind of internal disturbance and problems. In terms of factions within the Taliban themselves, the Taliban do have certain factions and do argue and debate with each other. But there's also a lot of rumor attached to things. So I don't know any good source that can confirm that Mullah Baradar was actually shot at in any way by the Haqqanis in that meeting a month or so ago. It appears more like it was just a verbal altercation, and that's the term that the Pashto press uses, verbal altercation, not shooting. So they do have differences within each other, and I wouldn't want to say that 4 or 5 years from now that we can't see those break out, or the group break into different amounts of fighting with each other. Any kind of leadership transition is a natural point of weakness for the movement, in which you could see greater amounts of fighting occur. But I'm also, within the next year or so, I'm a little skeptical that we'll see a great amount of factional infighting break out. But like I said, I'm always learning more about Afghanistan, so I could be wrong.
Well, on this very thought-provoking and forward-looking note, just thank you so much, Dr. Malkasian, for speaking to us tonight and sharing with us some really deep and important insights on this topic that so many of us are currently interested in and debating about. Just a couple of notices from me before we end. If you enjoyed this and would like to join us next week, the event will be in person, and Dame Marriott Leslie will be speaking to us about Scottish foreign and defence policy and the implications of Scottish independence. And also just a quick reminder that the deadline to sign up for the war game, which will be on 24th of November, is this Friday. Finally, for all of you who have time to stay for an informal chat with Dr. Malkasian and the other members, please do stay on the call. And thank you again so much, Dr. Malkasian, for speaking to us tonight.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for everyone. Thanks for the fantastic questions.